There is a new study, this is quite fascinating, looking into what we may be missing in terms of side effects to weight loss drugs. Now, I say interesting because, of course, this group of drugs has been talked about for so long now. We've discussed this on the show before with doctors as well. So we have clinical trials, but this is something completely different. This study, I guess, basically looks into what we may be missing in those clinical trials, because what it does is it's looked into a variety of social media posts from people who are actually on these medications and documenting their own journeys, which is really pretty fascinating. Neil Sehgal is a doctoral student at the University of Pennsylvania School of Engineering and Applied Science, and he is on the line. He's also the study's first author. Thanks so much for taking the time. When I said this is really quite fascinating, my first sort of question was, have we done this typically, or do you aware of this with other medications where we're basically looking at users and seeing what they have to say about their side effects?
Yeah, thanks for having me. So we have done this before. This field of kind of pulling social media comments and looking at what side effects people are having is not new. People have been doing this for over 10 years with different types of drugs. But I think what is new is that there's been a lot of advances in AI over the past 2 years. And so now we can kind of do this much faster and much more accurately. And so we can do this just at a larger scale, and we can do this in real time for lots of drugs. And so I think what's really changed is just we can do it at a pace we couldn't do before.
Yeah, and when you say numbers, I mean, I looked at the numbers. So you analyzed here, more than 400,000 posts and more than 70,000 users. That's a pretty significant database.
Yeah, so I think it's a large number, and what's really nice is that on Reddit you have these people posting these very long, detailed stories about their experiences on these drugs. And so, clinical trials have maybe 20,000 people if they're really large, and here we have a much larger scale. Of course, there are differences in how much data we get, but it is a large scale.
So you take this data, and you mentioned clinical trials, which I guess we still consider the gold standard. So what does this information that you've now been able to garner online help you do?
Yeah, so clinical trials are definitely the gold standard, but they have limitations, right? And so they're short, and so they might not pick up on symptoms that emerge after a few years. They're also expensive and can't always enroll tens of thousands of people. And so with Reddit, we have a much larger sample, and it's not necessarily representative. The type of people who use Reddit are a different population than, the people who use these drugs on average. So there are reasons that clinical trials are good. It's just Reddit allows us to say, how is this operating in the real world?
Right.
The way people use drugs in the real world is different than how they're prescribed.
So what have you found so far? Anything you could say, a consensus of opinions? What have you found?
Yeah, so I think what we found is that the most common side effects that people were having on Reddit, things like nausea or vomiting or constipation, these line up pretty well with what clinical trials have found. But we did notice a few side effects that have not been previously reported for these drugs in the trials. So, for example, about 4% of users in our sample who described side effects reported menstrual irregularities. So things like irregular flow or heavier flow, and other Redditors described unusual temperature-related symptoms like chills or hot flashes. And so these aren't things that showed up in the clinical trials. And to be clear, we can't say for certain whether these drugs are causing menstrual irregularities or temperature issues. We're just saying that these are signals in the data that deserve more investigation.
Right. But it's interesting to note because it says about 44% of the Reddit users that you analyzed reported at least one side effect. So that's almost half of people actually saying, yeah, we've had a side effect of one kind or another.
Yeah, so I think one thing is when you think about like a restaurant review, how often do you leave a restaurant review online? Probably when you've had a really good experience or a really bad experience. And if you've had just an okay experience, you might not leave a restaurant review. And so I think when you look at our data, you kind of have to consider the same thing. People who've had really good experiences on these drugs or people who've had really bad experiences on these drugs are probably the people who are most likely to comment. And so we're seeing that, 44% of people on Reddit who say that they're using these drugs are having side effects. But I don't know how many people on Reddit are, being driven to post in the first place. So you have to take that in mind.
Well, it's funny you say that, though, because I would think they're the ones probably least likely to be, pushed to post to anything because you're describing, what's happening to you and you're just sharing that opinion with others. Why do you think there's sort of a rush to post?
Yeah, I think when you look at these posts, you see all types of posts. And so some people are sharing their experience and looking for support. Some people are giving advice to others. Some people are talking about things that, maybe they wouldn't feel comfortable talking to their real friends in person or to their doctor about. So it's a whole community on here. And we're not just looking at one specific forum or subreddit. We're looking at a variety where the community norms are different across them.
You mentioned the menstrual changes. That comes up a lot. From what I saw, fatigue seemed to be one that came up a lot as well, right?
Yeah, so fatigue we found was kind of one of the most common side effects. And actually in the clinical trials that have been done, fatigue comes up sometimes and sometimes it doesn't. What happens in a clinical trial is you have, half the people on the drug and half the people on a placebo drug. So they're not actually getting the drug, but they think they are. And in these clinical trials where they found that fatigue isn't really a side effect, they find that the people on the placebo also report fatigue quite a bit. And so that's why they say maybe fatigue isn't a side effect, because a lot of people just have fatigue on the placebo. And so importantly, in our study, we don't have a placebo. We're just looking at people who report fatigue. So we can't say for certain, again, that fatigue is a side effect. It's just a signal in our data that we think deserves more investigation.
Yeah, I guess the next question becomes: you have all this data. What's next? Obviously, the companies that manufacture these drugs are aware of this data. Have you had any reaction from them?
Yeah, so I know that the companies are have provided comment on the study. I think a few directions feel promising. So one, I hope that researchers look into what we found and do more rigorous investigation into these unreported side effects like menstrual changes. I think the bigger opportunity is just kind of popularizing this framework that we've developed to other medications that are exploding in popularity faster than our formal safety monitoring can keep up with. And so outside of these GLP-1s that we looked at, there's tons of peptides that people are using off-label. So GLP-1s are a type of peptide, but peptides are being used for mental clarity and for skin collagen, and they're kind of all being used off-label, and people are sharing their experiences on social media, and they're sharing their side effects. And so I think really the opportunity is to apply these AI methods to other drugs that people are using to try to understand people's experiences and what they're using them for, and the benefits, but also the adverse effects.
Yeah, I should mention as well, to be fair, right? I mean, this study, it's great, a lot of numbers, a lot of posts, but this is not cause and effect necessarily, right? I think people have to understand that as well. These are just opinions.
Right. So you could imagine that someone who's on one of these drugs and separately has been having a lot of fatigue lately, they might, connect the dots and say, oh, I started this drug recently, I'm having fatigue, it must be causal. Right. But we don't know that for sure. It could be that the fatigue is being caused by something else, and someone just thinks that the only thing that's changed recently is that they're on this drug, and they make this post. And so we're just treating these as true, but that is definitely a limitation. We don't know. Nothing here is causal.
Yeah. So correlation where causation, and it's important to keep that in mind. All right. I thank you so much for the time today. Very much appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I really appreciate the interest.
iHeartRadio is throwing it back.
2010s, the decade.
To the days of huge hits and unforgettable anthems. A non-stop stream of the biggest and best.
Drake, Rihanna, Beyonce, Katy, Gaga, The Weeknd,
and more. All your decade-defining favorites, all in one place.
Hi, it's Katy Perry.
Hey, it's Bruno Mars.
This is Kesha.
Find 2010's The Decade on the free iHeartRadio app. Preset the station so it's always one tap away.